We can use Sabian symbols as a method to help us deal with our emotional blocks. Everyone has emotional blocks. When we're children, we pick them up in the earliest weeks and months of our lives. We're very vulnerable as children. We have this openness to all and everything as young babies. And things in the outer environment of our life, physical, emotional, impact upon us in a way which is uncomfortable. Now, if this happens frequently, persistently, or if this happens suddenly with an emotional intensity, either way, we're going to pick up an emotional block. There's no two ways around that. Every one of us on the planet has emotional blocks. Now, if we're studying astrology seriously, and Sabian symbols in particular, we're more of the mind to address them, to look into the possibility that we can actually deal with that problem. We can see it as a problem that needs solving. We're looking for a solution. How do we deal with this? So I'm going to take you through a process that I've used in my own case, so that serves as a model or an example for you. I had two major issues that I wanted to look at, and they seemed very clearly to relate to two of my planets. So let's take the Saturn one first. First of all, let me say that Saturn, generally speaking, for all of us, has a particular mode of operation. And that is that it expresses in three different dimensions, shall we say. The lower level is when you're not awake. You're asleep, you're walking through life as though you're drugged or blindfolded or drunk or something. You just don't really think about what you're doing. When Saturn operates on that level of consciousness, there is this sense of denial, refusal. We don't like Saturn. Saturn is the finger wagger, the authority figure, the external bully, the one thing or person that can tell us what to do when we don't want to do that thing. That's what Saturn is, at least when you have not really learned how to handle it. When you have learned how to handle it, then you carry out your duties in an appropriate way. So the highest level of Saturn is when you appropriately do the necessary. Whatever house it's in or sign it's in or aspect it makes, there's an appropriate responsibility that you have, a duty, a position of responsibility or authority. They very often go hand in hand. Now, if you do this in a conscious way, it's done with a minimum amount of force. You do it very gently. You do not get into overkill. You don't become a bully, for example, or an obsessive person. So that's the highest dimension of his expression. And Saturn is associated with old age and gravitas, seriousness, maturity. It's the old man, the stooped old man walking along, who's not going to make any foolish errors. He doesn't do foolish things anymore. That's Saturn. Now, between those two stages, the first when you deny the Saturn energy, the third when you use it appropriately, there is this middle section in life. And it's not completely wrong to suggest that the stages have to do with your first Saturn return. And when you go through that, then you start moving into the second stage, which now I'll discuss. The second stage is overdoing it. You've come to an awareness during your Saturn return, for example. It could be another time. But let's say during your first Saturn return, age 29, you've come to an awareness that actually the track you're walking on isn't going to take you where you want to be. It might be lovely to stay out at night getting drunk and to sleep around and to not worry too much about your career or anything else. It's a lovely thing to do when you're freed of parental control and you're in your 20s and young and energetic. It's a wonderful thing just to ignore all the Saturn in the world and have fun. Wonderful. And then your Saturn return comes and it's just like, oh, I can see where this is going, and you can probably already experience it. You've lost a certain amount of respect amongst your family and your peers, and maybe your body is showing signs of abuse and so on, and you just wake up. This will not stand. I need to make some changes. Now, here comes the second stage of Saturn. When you get into overkill, you go into an obsessional attitude to fulfilling your duties or to carrying out the Saturn energy. And that carries on until you've learned that going over the top isn't appropriate either, certainly not for Saturn. The appropriate way to use the Saturn energies is in moderation, of course. We don't learn that perhaps until the second Saturn return in your late 50s. Now, for me, to look at Saturn seemed really obvious. Its position in my horoscope, my Sabian position, is the 26th degree of Virgo, which has to do with a boy swinging a censer. So this is a choir boy, presumably carrying out a sacred duty, a ritual. He's engaged in a religious ritual. And so I was looking at this. This seemed to be quite appropriate for me, because when I was young, I really refused all of that. I would not participate in any sacred ritual. And the deeper meaning of the sign is not only religious, it's any duty of service carried out in a specifically kind of high sacred way. That wasn't me. I would not do that. I was rebellious against that in a very determined way. After my Saturn return, I kind of changed career, and I became a leader of a dance form called Dances of Universal Peace, which is a meditative form, and one of the practices of the teachers from whom I learned this would operate the principle of ritual. Sometimes they would create a ritual process through the dances, and this was very sacred. This was beautiful and done in silence, and we had to get all the steps exactly so. It was an old style mystery enacted through ritual. It was lovely. I really found it very inspiring, and I started to feel a change within me. I no longer felt that my history of denial of all this sacred stuff was a problem anymore. In fact, I felt so keenly aware that I'd been wrong, shall we say, in my early life, that I went over the top in actually trying to correct that. So as a dance leader, I would lead sacred ritual all of the time. Every time I would lead a dance weekend, almost a day of the weekend would be spent learning the ritual and practicing the ritual, and that's what my weekends were. You know, we were very serious as a dance group compared to my teachers, who would perhaps use the ritual to celebrate a special occasion like Easter. So this continued for a long time. I would do these sacred rituals for most dance meetings for a very long time. And then I was kind of approaching my second Saturn return, and it started to feel like I was doing too much. It just wrong somehow. And something else happened at the same kind of time. During all this time when I was teaching this sacred stuff, I'd given up everything. I wouldn't drinking, for example, and certain other things. And I was very monk-like, very austere. And I thought that was the appropriate thing to be for a spiritual teacher. And I had this idea of that role in life, and that I was a part of that, and that this is the way you should be. And there was a lot of Saturn finger-wagging going on in my own head. You know, you're doing this, so you should do it in that way. And at some point into all of this kind of, you have to bring in the Sabian symbols. I was starting to get more and more and more involved in Sabian symbols during this time. And when I read my Saturn in Virgo symbol, the boy with the censer, and I realized that that was me. leading that ritual. In this case, I was the authority. It was my Saturn that was in that position. I wasn't the boy with the censer. I was the priest instructing the boy with the censer. It's the same energy from the different side. And I came to realize that that's what I was doing. And I also saw this explanation of Saturn's 3 dimensions of operation somewhere. And I pieced the 2 things together, and I'd realized that I'd just become obsessional about leading ritual. And because of studying my Sabian symbol, I was able to realize that that was what I was doing. And it was a very subtle understanding. So I realized that I had to give up this obsession I had for leading ritual. And pretty much simultaneously, I gave up the idea of having to be a teetotaler. If one is a spiritual person, one must not drink wine. That was going on in my head. And this block I had had about what should be done, what shouldn't be done, what is sacred, what is not sacred. I had this idea somehow that I was told this behavior is good, this behavior is sacred, and that behavior is bad, that behavior is forbidden. Somehow in my mind I'd received this understanding, Saturn understanding, you'll notice, and I followed it. At first I thought, well, I'm not going to do what I'm told, and rejected it. But the second phase of my experience of this was also dysfunctional, almost like doing it to apologize for having not done it. And then perhaps very shortly after my second Saturn return, I kind of moved into a more balanced approach, which is where I hope I am now, where I'll have a glass of wine occasionally, but not often. I'll lead ritual if it's appropriate, but not unless. It's a more appropriate sense of the responsibility that goes along with Saturn. Now, in a similar way, I can discuss Mars. Whereas the Saturn energy that was dysfunctional was this sort of belief that there's good and bad, that one behaves in this way if one is good, and that way if one is bad. That was my emotional block that I wanted to clear with Saturn. With Mars, it's to do with anger, really. My Mars position is conjunct my Sun, squaring Pluto. Sun Mars conjunct in Taurus, square Pluto. There is within me the potential for very powerful anger. And when I was a young boy, I had no idea what to do with this. I didn't do anything with it. I just bottled it up. I wasn't even a very aggressive rugby player, although I was playing that kind of sport to get some of it out. Now, there are 4 levels of expression of Mars, I would say, and if we look at the worst expression, it's inwardly directed. As an aggressive force directed against yourself. That amounts to depression. That's what depression is, according to some astrologers. A higher level of expression of Mars would be aggression, where you are aggressive against someone outside of yourself. Very interesting to think about this. Inwardly directed aggression leads to depression. Outward expression of that same energy, aggression against another person, is pretty much forbidden by society. And yet there are some examples where, as a counsellor, you might want to trigger somebody from depression into aggression, because it's a step in the correct direction. I remember a man came to me once. He was moaning about his life, and he was pretty seriously intending to commit suicide. That's what he told me. And I had this flash of understanding or whatever. But I started laughing at him and just not taking him seriously. And he became very, very angry with me. Of course. You go to a counsellor because you feel suicidal and the counsellor just laughs at you. You're going to get angry. And he was very angry with me. But he didn't commit suicide. His depression was moved outward against me. I mean, he never spoke to me again. Now, if you take that level of aggression to the next level, the fiery edge is gone. It becomes assertiveness. This is what I want and I'm having it. I will find a way. You can do that without hurting somebody else if you're assertive. And at the highest level of Mars, it's called devotion, where you express all of that vital life force towards your spiritual evolution. So these are the 4 levels of Mars. And when I was starting to kind of relate my emotionality with my planetary positions and then add in the Sabian dimension and just try to work it all out for myself, I saw that my Mars was in this 20th degree of Taurus, wind, clouds and haste. Basically, it's about allowing yourself to be used as a channel for spirit, just to be open and allow the flow of life to take you wherever spirit wants you to go, even to the point of channeling. I wouldn't allow that when I was younger. If I felt unhappy with myself and perhaps depressed or aggressive or whatever, I would eat something, and I would move quickly away from where I was. I would run or I would eat. I certainly wouldn't look at the problem and deal with it properly. And yet, when I looked at this image in Sabian sort of symbols, wind, clouds and haste, it seems so lovely to me. I just really relate to that image of beauty floating across the sky, just gently finding its own way forward, its own evolutionary path. No push, no shove, no aggression, no depression. It's just floating. I love that image. And I started to try that rather than to assert my own situation, even to the point of aggression. I stopped doing that quite so much. And then I stopped doing it at all, eventually, and started just to accept whatever came my way and to move my Mars energy into an experience of devotion by allowing these unseen spirit forces access to my being. And I just became a spokesperson sometimes for what needed to be said in a moment, or I did the thing that needed to be done in the moment, and I went to the place that was appropriate at the moment. I found myself useful in that place. And I started to kind of flow along with something. I would call it a feeling, but it was not that. I just acted. I did without thinking or feeling or anything. I just did what I did. And it was amazing. I started to notice synchronicity all the time. If I actually wanted to see somebody, I would perhaps go downtown and there they were. I could almost use synchronicity as a tool. It became very much more fluid, my life. And anger somehow just bubbled away. I don't get angry anymore. And I used to get angry a lot. So these are my planets, Saturn and Mars. They're not everybody's. We've got our emotional blocks stored wherever they might be stored. And for some of us, our Mercury's fine, but our Venus needs a bit of help, and so on. And you'll have to find your own. But the idea is that you identify emotional problem. You look at your Sabian symbol for the planet that you think it might be. But it might not be. You might have to look around. You might have to talk to an astrologer or another astrologer. But eventually you kind of somehow land on the understanding of, yes, that Sabian symbol relates to this emotional block. That's not easy. That's a little bit like doing a crossword puzzle. You just got to look at it, think and try things, and it takes time, and it's a bit of a game. You have to be doing this in a plodding, determined kind of way over a period of time, probably. But eventually you get the alignment working out where this emotional block relates to that Sabian symbol. Then it's almost solved. All you do then is read the text, study Jones, study Rudyard, read what I've put on the website, read what I put there, and something will happen. Something will happen to you. You will form your own interpretation. You will form your own alignment between what can be done, what needs to be done, and actually what you're doing, and see if there's a difference. And try something else according to what the Sabian symbol tells you. Begin on the literal level. You know, if it's a boy waving a censer around, then just go and have a wave of a censer. If it's to do with pheasants on your lawn, go to the zoo and see some pheasants. Take it on the literal level. It's not because it works on the literal level always. Sometimes it does, but rarely. It's because that's how you tell yourself you want this dealt with. Whatever question you legitimately, specifically, and determinedly ask the universe, you will get an answer. If you do that frequently enough, then you know you'll get an answer, to the point where you can actually ask your question and demand of the universe an answer and expect it. You get to that level, then you can actually find out what's wrong. Why have you got these emotional issues? There's always a reason. And there's a way of dealing with that. If for example, you're a bully because you were bullied as a child, then it's also true that you must also be a victim. Because the two things will always go together. There's always a convex and a concave aspect of every emotional block, always. So if you can identify one side of it, look for the other. If you're a persecutor, you are being persecuted. If you're a commitment phobe, then you're also overly grasping emotionally, you suffering, no, that's the wrong word, suffocating somebody else. Both of those sides of every emotional block can be seen if you know how to look. So if you're looking for two sides of an equation using the Sabian description, and you get this spark of intuition, yes, that's it. What you do is just stop doing what you don't want done to yourself. If you're being bullied, well, then stop bullying someone else. And by bullying, I don't mean beating somebody up with a stick. I mean using your power of emotional intelligence, your glamour, your seduction, your charm, using these things to get your way without the permission, the serious, considered, mature position of the other person. That's what I mean by bullying. Influencing somebody else against their capacity to resist you. If you're doing that to somebody else, then somebody's doing that to you, necessarily. That's how it works. If you don't like it happening to you, if your boss is shouting at you, stop shouting at your husband. That'll do it. That'll sort you out.